everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Tisch College and IGL's International Symposium on Preserving and Promoting Freedom of the Press. My name is Paloma Delgado. I'm the Programming Director this year for the IGL's Latin American Committee, and I'm so excited to have you all here with us this evening. So our panel discussion today will center on journalism in an era of misinformation and disinformation. The internet and social media have vastly democratized access to information to billions of people around the world. As we discussed in last night's panel on reporting under authoritarian regimes, this access to information can be a rich opportunity to get information out of controlled sources and government propaganda. But there's also a flip side. The explosion of content has also led to the ability to spread misinformation and disinformation, which can influence opinions, behavior, policy decisions, and governance, as well as affect vulnerable populations, sometimes at breakneck speed. Some of this content is malicious, and some is spread without malintent, yet in both instances, it can be incredibly alarming and challenging to reverse. The proliferation of misinformation and disinformation can pose security threats to countries and global institutions, as well as to individuals. Recent elections, global health crises, civil and international conflicts, and violent and tragic events have all felt these pernicious effects. I'm delighted to be joined today by this incredible panel to help us better understand misinformation and disinformation. I want to begin by introducing Brett Schaefer, a senior fellow and head of the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Information Manipulation Team, and an expert in computational propaganda, state-backed information operations. Welcome, Mr. Schaefer, if you'd like to begin your opening remarks. Thank you so much, Brett. Now I'm going to introduce Tiffany Sue from the New York Times. Sue is a reporter on the technology team of the New York Times covering misinformation and disinformation.
Okay, I don't know how I can follow that, but I get asked a lot what my job is like, and I was telling some of the panelists earlier that my workday begins every day with a very deep sigh and ends every day with a very deep sigh, because you go online, you listen to the radio, you watch the TV, and you think, how is it possible that there's so much crap so easily accessible all the time? So I started out initially as a media reporter. I was covering advertising and marketing, and I found that as I was reporting on these topics, as I was, looking into audio platforms, into Fox News, misinformation kept coming up. I was constantly finding that my coverage was dovetailing with questions about what is legitimate information, who is a legitimate information distributor, and I eventually just joined the excellent misinformation and disinformation team at the Times. And to be able to say that is kind of a rarity, because there are many news outlets that don't have the resources to be able to give as much attention to this topic as we're able to. And frankly, I think that gives us a responsibility to drill deep into a subject that covers any aspect of information you can think of. I mean, just some of the stories that I have written recently involve multilingual misinformation ahead of the midterm elections, the fact that there are 41 million people in the US who believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory surrounding the Uvalde shooting, around the invasion of Ukraine, platform accountability, the money behind misinformation, moderation and interventions. And right now I'm focusing on the midterms because they're coming up. So the questions that my team is asking are questions like, what are the problematic narratives that are out there? Where are they coming from? Who are they targeting? Who's spreading them? What can we do about them? Why should we care? So I'm lucky to be able to do this kind of reporting with a group of people that focus on various elements of this. My colleagues are Stuart Thompson, who is a whiz with data, Steve Lee Myers, who's reported around the world and handles a lot of the international spread of misinformation, Shira Frankel, who just co-wrote a fantastic book about Facebook and its struggles with content moderation, and Cecilia Kong, who works out of Washington, D.C. In short, this is a beat that has proven to be deeply, deeply depressing and nightmare-inducing, where you wake up and think, which conspiracy theorist is going to publicly call me a hack and force me to email my security team to ask about protections I have to take. But it's also fascinating and really heartening to see that there is a growing group of researchers, journalists, specialists, politicians that are coming together to talk about it.
Great. Thank you so much for those remarks. Our next speaker is Ilya Lozovsky. Mr. Lozovsky is a Tufts and Epic alum. He's our next speaker. He's joining us from Amsterdam, where he's a staff writer and editor at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. I'll now turn it over to you, Ilya.
we've disinformation going into the Iraq War. There was disinformation. Of course, the Soviet Union was one big effort at disinformation. I think it's always there. What changes is the form of it and the consequences of it. I think we'd be mistaken to think that good journalism is always a bulwark against it. I'm all pro. And I wish I had a better answer about what would. I do. There's some encouragement in the fact that people have extraordinarily good bullshit detectors on the internet when it comes to scams, financial scams, social security and whatnot. I think people, blow through their spam and click through their emails, discarding stuff that looks like crap all the time. Even though misinformation is not entirely analogous, I think people's bullshit detectors can become more advanced over time. Maybe that's wishful thinking. Tiffany would know better, but we'll just talk a little bit about my own experience with kind of old-fashioned disinformation. In the run-up to the Iraq War, I was covering the White House at the time, magazine, and a couple of high-level sources in the White House tried to plan a story with me about the wife of, and you may have heard about this, this was the famed CIA leak case at the time, but it was about the wife of someone who had been sent by the CIA to go investigate claims that Saddam Hussein was getting uranium from Africa. Well, in an effort to discredit him, some people in the administration quietly, sotto voce, told reporters about his wife, who had been a covert operative for the CIA. Now, it was never entirely clear how that factor discredited him. It's, it always had an underlying ridiculousness of, like, real men don't let their wives send them out to find uranium. But nevertheless, they made a big deal about it at the time. And I wound up in a legal situation that went all the way to the Supreme Court in terms of protecting my sources. That was old-fashioned disinformation without Facebook. But it worked. The country did, not that particular cul-de-sac, but in general, the campaign for war in Iraq was successful for a lot of reasons, and a lot of very smart journalists and columnists were too accepting. Willing to use them, and even more incredulously was willing to give them to terrorists so he wouldn't leave fingerprints on them. So I guess I would just keep in mind that these are new technological problems, but the larger issue of disinformation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. Now I'm going to turn it to Allison Lee. Allison Lee is joining us from Los Angeles, where she serves as the Los Angeles director at PEN America. PEN America is celebrating its 100th anniversary in the fight to defend free expression and support for defenders. Welcome, Ms. Lee.
US. And I can talk about, our research and the work and the campaigns that we've done, the work that we've done to when a journalist has to, notify their security team about a threat, what sort of work do we do within newsrooms to make sure that journalists know what their rights are, that newsrooms are prepared to protect journalists from online harassment. The research that we've done, we specifically did in 2018 and 2019 in preparation for the 2020 election, recognizing the rise of disinformation and its potential impact on our political processes. I can talk about that a little bit later, but I think the one thing that I kind of want to highlight is that we're living in a time where we are seeing what happens. We're seeing the impact of what happens when disinformation is normalized and mainstreamed. And we've seen that after I think January 6th is very much a reflection of what happens when, something becomes an animating force and then influences politics. So, this has moved out of just the theoretical. This has moved out. We're now seeing it change movements. And for us, that's why, at Penn America, that's why it's an issue of human rights. That's why I come to this work as a human rights defender. I've seen before the journalists who are working in hotspots around the world that they're the ones who, they are the canaries in the mine. They are the ones who tell us, when the freedom to write is threatened, we know that other freedoms are not far behind. And so when we're kind of focused on this particular issue, it's not just the freedom to write, but it's what do we accept as fact, and who do we allow to influence what is being said. And so, I'm with everybody else. I think it's like what you said, you start your day with a sigh and you end your day with a sigh. I'm grateful for the convening today, because as hard as it is to hear what everyone is saying, I was listening to This American Life this weekend, and I think Ira Glass ended it with when living in dark times, it doesn't help us to pretend that we're not living in dark times. And, I think this issue is certainly one that we need to pay attention to, not just because of its impact on the act of journalism, but its impact on the outcomes of things that matter very dearly to us. So I look forward to the continued conversation this afternoon.
He's the Director of Development for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, an organization that works to protect the First Amendment freedom
So I am speaking on behalf of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. The Reporters Committee was founded in 1970. It was a period of unrest over racial injustice, an unpopular foreign war, a deeply cynical and divided political climate. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. And the nation's news media were facing a wave of government subpoenas asking them to reveal the names of their confidential sources. In response, media outlets, funders, and legal institutions created a new kind of organization that was meant to provide free legal resources, training, support in litigation, support in amicus briefs, and other education to provide a legal defense for the free press inside the United States. We recognize that the threats facing journalists in the US are not always the same as those facing members of the press internationally, in the former USSR, in South Asia, the Middle East, Latin America. The US has a strong First Amendment and a generally resilient democracy, although protections for our free press were historically mostly extended to the members of the favored groups on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation. And only recently has that been changed. Generally speaking, American journalists don't face the same risks of imprisonment or torture or having their sources interrogated or their equipment confiscated. But this is not always the case, because in recent years, American journalists have been killed. They have had their sources interrogated. They have had their electronic equipment surveilled by local government, state government, and federal governments. And we know that misinformation and disinformation campaigns are a big part of this. As we've heard from our speakers, misinformation and disinformation, they target political beliefs and hot-button issues like elections, COVID restrictions, police brutality, gun violence. All of these are areas in which misinformation and disinformation can place American journalists at risk. And the misinformation dilemma falls in the midst of a whole host of threats facing journalism in the United States, including the fact that newsroom budgets are shrinking and legal budgets are often the first to be cut. So journalists don't always have the same kind of legal protections from the general counsels as they might once have had. And local journalists and officials often don't even know what rights does the public have to access information. So there's an increasing culture of secrecy, especially in local and state governments, that shields data, documents, and other public records, especially around sensitive issues like law enforcement, which is where we have a lot of our public records cases relate to access to information about law enforcement and alleged police brutality. As we've heard from Matthew and from Allison, a lot of the debates about misinformation in the United States focus on social media platforms. Social media don't have the same mandate and the responsibility and ethical obligations to uphold truth that traditional print and broadcast journalists were supposed to uphold. And there are also no content restrictions. That means that the shrinking revenues and advertising dollars for local media feeds into a kind of a vicious cycle. More and more people are turning to social media as a source of their news that starves local newspapers and broadcasters of revenues, and it also contributes to the unverifiable and possibly propagandistic content that can then sort of get laundered into the news cycle, which is something I think is an interesting discussion point, which I think we heard a little bit about in the international context. Inside the United States, there are some alarming legal approaches. The states of Texas and Florida have put forth neutrality obligations that they're trying to impose on social media platforms on the argument that social media are big and they present a new mode of communication with a variety of potential legal risks. Those are actually very similar arguments that were made in the 1970s over the Pentagon Papers, the Watergate reporting, and other investigative journalism. And the concern is if laws targeting bias and disinformation like those of Texas and Florida are allowed to stand, you could end up in a sort of Orwellian ministry of truth scenario where the government could decide what's fair, what can be shared in one media platform, which in principle could be imposed on other media platforms. A couple of things the Reporters Committee has been particularly active on. One is that press are frequently at risk in the protests of First Amendment protected freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Protests around COVID restrictions, gun violence, elections. And when journalists cover the protests, they're frequently targeted either by the protesters themselves or by the police. So in America, as well as around the world, journalists are most frequently at risk when they're covering political speech and protest activities. The Reporters Committee was a founding partner of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, and every year the Press Freedom Tracker publishes a report on the state of press freedom, and it routinely finds that protests are the most dangerous place for journalists to cover because nearly half of American press freedom incidents, including arrests of journalists, confiscations of their equipment, attacks, occur at protests. So we've published a guide called Police Protesters in the Press to help members of the press understand how they can safely cover First Amendment protected freedom of speech and freedom of assembly while avoiding arrest and possible physical violence. We also know, as we've heard from several of our speakers, that the upcoming mid-real, maybe say one of the pressure tests of how strong our democracy is and how strong our democratic institutions are. So we've been publishing an election guide and trainings for members of the media in both English and Spanish, and I was happy to hear a discussion about multilingual misinformation campaigns in advance of the 2022 midterms with specific information on legal standards in battleground states on things like how to cover exit polling, news gathering near polling places, access to ballots and records, and even stuff like ballot selfies. There's always big issues whether it's legal to post a ballot selfie in certain states, and it actually is a subject of some interesting legal analysis. And RCFP has a wide range of resources for American journalists, which I'm happy to go into. I'm not sure where I stand on time, but I think this is great to have the international perspective from a lot of our panelists, and then also to look at the threats facing journalism inside the United States. So thank you so much for the invitation.
All right.
People can use this to amplify a little bit.
Okay.
Got it. Is it on? Is it working? Hello, can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Carolina. All right, well, thank you everybody for all of your remarks, for setting the scene before we move into our discussion questions for this afternoon. So our first question, Turkey has recently proposed a disinformation bill, which claims to prevent the spread of misinformation in the press and social media. In reality, there's growing concern that the bill threatens free speech and could potentially harm journalists. How can we, on the one hand, prevent disinformation on a global scale, but also ensure that we are not silencing or censoring the voices of reporters? And is the bill in Turkey a forewarning of others to come? So if anybody would like to answer that here or in our webinar.
Skeptical of the Turkish government getting to decide what's information and what's not. And I think even in countries like Germany, where everything is mostly okay with democratic freedoms and freedom of the press, you do have laws, for example, banning, the swastika or Nazi, symbols, which certainly I think you can defend in an argument. But on the other hand, I don't think it has prevented far-right activism in Germany, or in fact, even infiltration of, for example, the police. The New York Times did some great reporting on infiltration of far-right elements into the German security services and police. So I am pretty happy in many ways, with where the United States landed a long time ago with the First Amendment, and with really quite strong and nearly absolute protection for freedom of speech, although I don't think any of us are going to be mourning what happened to Alex Jones recently. But so that's my response. Is I think that laws like that have the potential of being super dangerous in the hands of many governments. And for me, it's a little hard to see an upside, although I can also imagine a pretty strong counter argument. So that's just for me.
Anybody want to add? Yeah.
Yeah, just to bring this back to the United States context, I think that is exactly the concern over, vaguely worded rulings and proposed bills on disinformation campaigns that could impose restrictions on First Amendment rights of both traditional broadcast and print media, but also could impose content restrictions in the social media world. And that's the concern about the bills in Florida and in Texas, which have yet to be really tested at the constitutional level. But as the Reporters Committee's much wiser attorneys, I'm not an attorney, have told me, it clearly doesn't meet the First Amendment constitutional standards. But while there ambiguity exists of bills being put forth at state levels, you run the risk of that chilling effect where people aren't sure what they can and what they cannot share. And in principle, that could be used to crack down on a social media platform whose content runs afoul of whatever government is in power in that particular state at the time. And that's the sort of ministry of truth scenarios that we're concerned about.
Great, thank you so much.
Allison Lee has raised her hand.
Okay, yeah, Allison.
On the news today, like in Uganda, the president of Uganda has issued, wants to have a bill that will, under the auspices of preventing hate speech that most critics say will actually stifle free speech. So I think it's, again, this whole idea of like, if a government entity gets to decide what is or isn't information versus disinformation, hate speech versus free speech, without something like the First Amendment, you run into issues. In April of this year, PEN America issued a report on hard news. It was entitled Hard News, it was a survey of 1,000 reporters and editors on how disinformation is disrupting the practice of journalism. And most newsrooms, as Tiffany said, most outlets do not have the resources to have an entire department dedicated to it. 80% of journalists say that disinformation is a serious problem. I think 11% of the journalists that we surveyed said that they themselves had unwittingly spread disinformation. It's very, while they had confidence in their own ability to detect it without the resources available to them, that they realized that, they themselves might have spread something that they weren't able to vet. It's having a tremendous impact on their experiences as journalists. And I think that speaks to the chilling effect that many people have said here. I mean, it's hostility from the public. 48% of journalists now feel frustrated and overwhelmed. The idea is, do people even want to write the story to begin with? Is it worth the hassle to write the story, to potentially be doxxed, to potentially, face their own issues of safety and security? And in fact, 17% felt like they considered maybe not moving forward or avoiding doing a story that they were considering covering due to the fear of fake news, backlash that they might see. And so, I think this kind of speaks to the toxicity of this idea of trying to determine, where no one wants to silence a voice, and yet the very nature of disinformation is that it silences the voices without even having to spread the lie, because people avoid those stories simply because the risk is too great.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. I'm going to move on to our next question. So across the world, false narratives are promoted regarding the war in Ukraine, like we've spoken about, the genocide of the Uyghur diaspora in China, and the murder of Mahsa Amini in Iran. Why is it that we've seen the increasing presence of misinformation and disinformation on a global scale? And how have local populations and everyday people been affected by the spread of disinformation? If we have anybody from the, oh, yes.
Particular. Governments have always lied to support their causes, particularly authoritarian governments. So I don't think there's anything new there. I think what we've seen, though, is an inversion of what we thought the internet would be. I mean, when I was in college in the early 2000s, the only literature you had about the promise of the internet was it was going to be a democratizing force that allowed activists to circumvent government controls. And it has, to a degree. I mean, right now, I think one of the things to stress is the only way Russians are getting accurate information about the war in Ukraine is through social media platforms. The Russian government, with all their efforts to sort of hyperbolically seal their information environment, Russians can still access the internet. And so I think we have to look still a little bit at the promises and the benefits of social media, of the internet, and not just the bad. But of course, authoritarians saw they recognized the winds have changed and they reacted to it. So what do authoritarians or governments have that average citizens don't? I mean, they have intelligence services, they have enormous resources, they can set up troll farms, they have state media outlets that can drown out the voices of citizens. So I don't think anything we're seeing here with the Chinese government or the Russian government is a shift for them necessarily. I think it is reaction to the early 2000s, where they saw it as a force for democratization or change, and they've reacted in kind.
So I should preface this by saying my framework is usually more US. I don't do a lot of reporting on foreign misinformation. So I'm looking at this from a domestic point of view, but there's research that suggests that the ratio of Americans who believe in conspiracy theories hasn't actually changed all that much over the years. But to go to Brett's point, the megaphone has changed. There are so many more venues for people to express false narratives or misleading narratives, and that's really the dynamic that that has captured people's attention over the past few years. It's that it is so much easier for conspiracy theories and rumors and lies to make their way to the average person. You know, I was talking to a professor who is an immigrant from Ghana for my last story about multilingual misinformation, and he pointed out a phenomenon that's known as the strength of weak ties. And in essence, it means that social media has allowed information to pass so quickly from person to person that a piece of information can reach a person who's not even on social media as long as it's just transferred once, right? So someone who is on social media can say, hey, I heard X on social media to a family member or a friend who isn't on Instagram or Facebook or Telegram or what have you. So the phenomenon of misinformation is not new in any stretch. I mean, there's a fantastic story in a book called The Misinformation Age. It was written by two UC Irvine professors. And in a nutshell, it's about something called the vegetable lamb of Tartary. Back, I think, in the late Middle Ages, an explorer came back to one of the great European courts and said, oh my God, I just went to India and I had the most delicious delicacy. It is a fruit and within it is a tiny lamb and it's delicious. And without any evidence whatsoever, royalty, experts, academics, they all believed this story. And over the ensuing century, it was just accepted as fact, largely because so many authority figures, including in the government, said, this is too wonderful to be a lie, ergo it must be true. And it was only debunked when at some point, more than 100 years later, some king sent a courtier to India to check it out, and he came back saying, I could not find a tiny lamb inside of a vegetable / fruit. The point being that the phenomenon has not changed. Everyone is susceptible to misinformation. There is a piece of research from a group called ACIS that studies Latino voters that found that actually a demographic that is especially likely to believe misinformation are young people who are highly educated. The difference now is just the forum. It's so much more open.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that the predisposition helps spread these things, right? I mean, if it's the anti-Muslim bias expressed against the Uyghurs and the Rohingya, a predisposition to be loathsome towards Muslims is gonna spread faster, as it did with Jews in Europe during the Second World War. Not every idea, right, is going to gain traction. Like anti-Belgian sentiments, like, Belgians secretly control everything. Not going to get the traction that other things do.
Thank you so much. Any other comments? I think we'll move into our next question. So there's growing concern, which we've kind of spoken about ahead of the midterm elections in the US, but the prevalence of disinformation looking toward upcoming elections, looking on a national scale, but also local elections in Taiwan, the presidential election in Brazil. So how does the spread of disinformation and misinformation affect democracies and free elections?
I think all of us are probably going to want to respond to that question, but looking specifically into the United States context, the Reporters Committee is very concerned about the issue of local and state level officials who are not only buying into but actively disseminating falsehoods about past elections and laying the groundwork to either refute or to actively push back against the results of future elections. And November. So we're only a month out from the midterms, and it's going to be a really important stress test in a lot of places where the local political officials are the ones who admit data, exit polls, or other things from officials who have already expressed a willingness to share and spread disinformation about elections. So from the perspective of a free press, it's very difficult for journalists to report when they're interacting with an elected official or an election official who is actively sharing misinformation. So how does that get reported on it? And it's also very concerning that, and we've already heard about this a little bit, certain targets, there's really more sophisticated, I think, micro-targeting of misinformation campaigns by language, political discourse about elections, and to report on it accurately, because some of that is very much below the radar screen. It's not on the local broadcast news or on the local print media, but it's hitting very specific target population through Facebook messaging and text threads, and it's even harder to reach those sorts of misinformation sources. That's, I think, one of the things that's facing American journalists in the build-up to the 2022 midterms.
I think it's important to just sort of recognize there's different kind of disinformation or misinformation that targets elections, some of which we've seen forever. When you look at disinformation targeting a political party or a candidate, I mean, that's always been there. I mean, there's been dirty tricks forever. And so when we're talking about fake news stories planted to try to get people to vote for or to not vote for a specific candidate, that's been there forever. And when we're looking at it in terms of an organization trying to defend elections, we don't even touch that kind of stuff. The other kind of mis or disinformation obviously gets a little bit more problematic, some of which gets to trying to suppress the vote. Some of that is potentially illegal. You, of course, can't tell someone that they can text their vote in, for example, which is a campaign we saw in 2016. There now actually is a criminal case against this right-wing activist that was targeting Black and Latino voters, telling them they could text their vote in or email their vote in. So there's voter suppression, mis or disinformation, trying to mislead people. What we're, of course, seeing now, it's not entirely new after 2020. There was a long buildup to it starting in 2016, gets to more of this election integrity issue. So election security, the validity of the vote. From our perspective, that's the biggest concern, because of course, if people stop believing the results of elections, democracy ceases to exist pretty quickly. And we got a little bit of a taste of that in 2020. And that hasn't gone away. It's grown significantly. And so we now see, I forget what the last count was, but there are 280 election deniers on the ballot this year for House seats, Senate seats, Secretary of State races, governorships. So 10 election deniers are running for Secretary of State. These are the people who are going to administer elections. And so some of them are predicted to win. And so you have to look at the other side then, who looks at an election denier who refuses to this day to admit Joe Biden won, who is going to be in control of an election, potentially. And what that's going to do to degrade confidence across the board in elections going forward. So from our perspective, that's the real threat. I mean, look, forever you've seen commercials telling voters that if a candidate wins, crime is going to be rampant and inflation's out of control. But this new strand that really gets to, should we trust the vote? I shouldn't say new strand, increasing strand of trying to get people to not believe the results of elections is really problematic and concerning.
There's one that, and what you said, Brett, in terms of like, we've all seen the political, I did not approve of this message before, Citizens United or whatever it was, but like the idea has always been there. What we are at now is misinformation or disinformation designed to reaffirm the confirmation bias that someone already has about their own point of view. And what that now is threatening the underpinnings of democracy, right? What that now does is not just, it doesn't just dampen voter turnout particularly for certain populations or for certain communities, it calls into question the whole affair. And I think, like, we certainly, I would agree, think that that's the difference of where we are now versus where we have what we have seen before.
So taking it back on a national level, in the United States, we've seen the emergence of fringe media platforms. We spoke a little bit about QAnon, InfoWars, Alex Jones, spewing conspiracy theories ranging from the stolen presidential election to tragic events like Uvalde and Sandy Hook. What role should social media platforms and companies have in preventing this disinformation? What further measures can be taken?
So Pew actually just did an interesting study on fringe platforms where it found that only 6% of Americans get their news regularly from at least one of 7 fringe platforms. So this includes like Truth Social, Telegram, Gab, Parler, etc. After that story ran, I immediately got a comment from someone who said, yeah, but that 6% is the loudest 6% in the room. They will readily tell everyone they come across everything that they've read on these platforms. So that said, this raises the question of whether or not moderation is effective at all. A lot of these platforms actually proudly say that they will not moderate beyond what is required by law. They will take down pornography, for example, but if you're out there, sharing the big lie, by all means, go for it. So the question that we hear a lot from researchers now is, it's one thing to go after Meta or TikTok or Twitter for their struggles with moderation. And to be sure, there are a lot of struggles. There's a lot of misinformation on all of those platforms. You can go on right now, search election, and within minutes you will find something that is provably not true. But the concern that I think is coming up a lot in academia and in the research community is that really are those really the venues that we need to be stressing, right? When a lot of the truly nascent misinformation is coming up on the fringe platforms that don't intend to moderate whatsoever.
Sit down. Can we hear? No. I'm gonna turn it back on. Do we have any responses from the webinar? No.
The challenging politics for the platforms right now and how they moderate content. When we started this work, I would do a lot of work in Europe where the big target was Section 230, which from the European perspective was a problem because it meant the platforms weren't doing enough to moderate harmful content. It was picked up by Trump, but for the exact opposite reason, that the platforms were doing too much and censoring conservative voices. So that is really, I think, tied the hands of the platforms because they see it as a sort of lose-lose situation. We saw that with the Hunter Biden laptop story, of course. And so they're in a situation right now where I don't think they know which way to go. And, to be fair, I think we ask too much of the platforms because if we were saying to the platforms, look, you are responsible for elevating authoritative, credible information, that means the platforms have to essentially step in and be making decisions about what is and what is not credible. The algorithm is not going to do that. What the algorithm does is it gives people what they want, and what we've seen is, unfortunately, what people want often is less credible information. So if we make these requests of platforms, we should understand what that means. That means the platforms have to be making determinations about not necessarily what is true and what is false, but what is credible from an outlet perspective and what is not credible. And then I think just a final point, we've done a lot of research looking at search engines, for example, and what happens when people run neutral search queries, but they're framed slightly differently and how that leads people to different information environments. So if you run a search for undocumented immigrants versus illegal aliens, you're sent to 2 entirely different information universes. And if you run a search query for a term the Russian government cares a bunch about, they're able to flood that zone, they're able to surface higher. And so in having talks with Google and Microsoft and others who have search engines, their response to that is, we recognize this as being a problem, but we also have to give people what they're looking for. And so if somebody's running a search for illegal aliens, for us to say, well, we're going to send you to bad information if we send you to conservative outlet, that puts them in a tricky situation that they don't want to be in, and of course creates a host of problems. So again, just to kind of wrap up, I think we have to be clear what we want from platforms, what we can expect them to do, and the potential problems that asking the platforms to solve these issues might create.
Can I jump in for a sec? I would just say that I think that to inject a note both of pessimism and of uncertainty, I think that the way we're talking about platforms now with, like there even being a public post that you can either ban or not ban or restrict or whatever, I think might not be super relevant for much longer. You already have so many different platforms that aren't really one big public space, but that are a bunch of distributed spaces like Telegram, even just WhatsApp groups, and things like that, where you really cannot ban somebody unless you're really somehow the platform is reading every message, even in the countless private groups. And so that's a thing that, like something like Facebook or Twitter, where it's like kind of one big space, I think that might be heading out and not be so relevant. And just think about, with AI, we've all seen the, images generated by AI prompts and what AIs can do with images and video and of course text. So the options for moderation, I think, will be very different. I just think that if we're looking at this space 10 or even 5 years from now, it might be basically unrecognizable from what it is now. I'm not sure what to take away from that, but I think that's where we're going.
Thank you so much, Ilya. Our final question, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So it might be easy for many of us to think that disinformation is something distant from our own lives. If we're not the ones intentionally creating pernicious content, how do we end up being part of the problem? So how can we all be a part of the solution, and what tips can you all offer to people to protect themselves from falling victim to disinformation and misinformation, and for perhaps spreading it, perhaps unknowingly?
It's not working. I'll just project, and apologies to the people on the Zoom. Yeah, I think one of the basic takeaways is people have to be responsible news consumers, and it's very hard if you're spending most of your time, flicker, and I am fully guilty of this, flickering through Twitter among people who mostly agree with your kind of worldview and mostly reinforce things you already might believe. But obviously, the mainstream media stuff doesn't get printed until journalists have a chance to vet the information from the sources. That's not the same on social media. I mean, obviously, if you're seeing some social media going crazy about something, you're not seeing it in the Times or the Globe or on CNN or Reuters or whatever, like, you might want to ask, why is it not yet in those platforms? Maybe because the mainstream journalist hasn't had a time to validate the data, and they're working on it as you're, scrolling through Twitter or social media. But also because, they're going to validate the sources and try to get some credible reporting on something before they share it. And secondarily, I think everyday citizens have to think about who's pushing what stories, are there agendas at work, and look for multiple reputable sources sharing similar content. Don't just share the first thing that, aligns with your worldview and, confirms your existing biases. I think it's hard to do sometimes.
It's not working, but
Oh, yeah, I'll project. Yeah, well, I think Michael's totally right about wanting to expose yourself to a diversity of sources. I always try to read things that I know I'm going to disagree with, because I think there's good in that, and occasionally I will find I don't disagree with them. I think you also have to, realize whoever you regard as the good guys are often wrong. I think MSNBC does good work, but I do think they got way out over their skis on Russian collusion with Trump. There's no question the Russians favored Trump, tried to influence Trump. The collusion was not, I think, as great as MSNBC portrayed for years. So I think you have to realize that the good guys are often, whoever you regard as the good guys, are often wrong too. And finally, I think you have some personal responsibility to avoid the platforms you consider odious, even if you get something good out of them. I mean, I stopped using Facebook, both because I think they were bad actors in the public space in terms of being a free-for-all for disinformation, but also I was tired of being like, a human in the matrix, just being used to have my data. I just don't use it anymore, which is, it's meant sacrifices. There are people I don't keep in touch with as much, but I can deal without a few sunset photos. And, I think people have to take responsibility for that.
I have a quick comment.
Yeah.
I did a story fairly recently about media literacy, and I talked to a lot of news, information, and media literacy experts, and something that they all said to me was, if you are on social media and you see something that makes you angry, especially if it's short, look at many, many other sources. Question why it's making you feel from college. And she did a survey of a bunch of her classmates in middle school and in high school. And what she said was she was getting a lot of her information from Instagram. She's very smart. She's very politically engaged. But she realized in retrospect that maybe getting all of her data points from one-liners on Instagram is not really a cohesive information gathering strategy.
It's a great point. Do we have any?
Try to be more of a truth seeker and less of a warrior, and to just try to not fight and defend things and just try to learn things. And I think for me, that's a good heuristic in which, everybody complains about how toxic Twitter is, and certainly it is. But if you follow people who are also doing that and refrain from responding to people who are trolling, there's always multiple debates going on at the same time on any issue. There's trolls fighting on one side, fighting trolls on the other side, and then there's smart people, sort of earnest, good-willed people on one side debating good-willed people on the other side, and you should just stay in that level and avoid the troll zone. So for me, for example, I find Twitter to be a really productive and interesting place where I learn a lot. So ever since I stopped responding to the likes of Glenn Greenwald and et cetera. But the problem, I think, is that it's like, it's so much less emotionally satisfying to use it that way. I enjoy it because I've sort of trained myself to, but certainly it's not the same as a hit of good old fashioned trollery. And it's the same as you can try to kind of tell everyone to stop drinking sugary sodas because it's bad for your health. But probably in the end, what's going to change things is if you have this incentives are structured differently so that you are not able to drink as many sugary sodas, or you can't, or you don't, So I just think that moralizing about this, it might be kind of helpful on an individual level. But I think if we're looking for societal change in how people use platforms, I think it has to be more of a structural change in what information is out there that's easy for them to consume. So then again, I would go back to the point I began with of let's make sure there is great content, but it's both interesting and fair and earnest, and people can consume, and maybe that will make a difference. But I'm not totally sure that it will.
I want to add 30 seconds, building on something Ilya just said. One of the points that I've been more attuned to recently is the importance of listening to people whose voices are traditionally underrepresented and not heard as well in the media. I just met on Tuesday a guy named Mukhtar Ibrahim. He's in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's a Somali-born journalist who founded a basically an online newspaper in Minnesota focusing on the immigrant communities who aren't well reported by the traditional Minneapolis, Star Tribune and whatnot. And he was telling a story about how he was with a elderly Somali man who had been, basically his home was raided by police, and he didn't know why. He was very confused. His English wasn't great, and it was only because Mukhtar was in the room was he was able to understand that the man's son had been killed in a confrontation with police the same day. The way he found out was that his home was raided by local officials. And that was a story that was not going to get picked up immediately in the Minnesota Public Radio or the Star Tribune. but it was because he was an immigrant covering the stories of immigrant communities that it was able to get out. And you're talking about the health of local media and providing resources for local media, and that's a very unusual and I think important model that we can look at to identify new and important sources of data that might not get otherwise reported.
Of the platforms, we are also the target. It's what Matthew said in terms of like recognizing that we and everyone else that are on there are consuming a product, and that it is a business, that they are not there with an agenda necessarily other than to make money off of us or from us, and to take the information that we get from those platforms in that context, I think is really important. I would get like a little esoteric and encourage people to, before they post or repost something, to remember what the poet Rumi said, like to stop and to think before you speak, and to, ask yourself, is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? And I think that happens, I know that's idealistic, but I think we would all be better served for that. And then the only other thing I would say as a graduate of Tufts is that, I feel like I was taught on that Hill that we weren't supposed to just have these conversations on a late Friday afternoon in a room, that we were supposed to take it out into the world. And I would say, to become an activist for free speech, to make sure that your campus is a space in which, free speech is supported, to educate yourself on the issue, and to take it outside of this room and outside of your own social spheres.
Just adding on very quickly to Allison's point, I mean, we're the consumer, we're the target, but we're also producers of information, even if we're just retweeting. Because when you retweet within your network or share on Facebook, then you become that source of information for your network. And so if you share something that turns out not to be true, you have a responsibility to fact check yourself. I mean, it's hard to do. Nobody wants to admit when they're wrong, but it's really damaging if you share something, particularly if it's something in a field where you're a trusted expert, and you don't correct those mistakes. And then kind of pivoting off Ilya's comment, like, it's fun to own the libs or dunk on conservatives, but we need to do a little bit more policing our own tribes. And, too many people are just looking for what the other side is doing wrong and not doing the work to check what's coming from people whose political, social beliefs align with yours.
Thank you so much. So that concludes the discussion aspect of our panel this afternoon. Thank you all for your incredible insight, your stories, and all the work that you've been doing to help address the spread of disinformation and misinformation. So we're now going to move into our Q&A session. So to our audience members and to our viewers, please limit your question to under a minute, and also please address your question to one of our panelists, either here in person or on the webinar. So we will have somebody helping us to... Yeah, no worries. Tiffany has to go. But,
Sorry. Thank you for having me.
Yes, Lauren.
Okay. I do have a specific question for Brett, but I also do have a wider kind of question. Brett, I was wondering, when you talked about an effort to poison the well with misinformation toward fact checkers, I wondered if you could just elaborate on that. But do you want me to ask the other question? Great, go ahead.
Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and the reporter who was there was their PolitiFact reporter, and he's been doing it for a decade. And he talked about the fact when he started his work, there was real reputational damage to getting like a For Pinocchio fact check. And over the years, it no longer became something that was reputational, that there was reputational damage associated with. People started fundraising off of his fact checks because the industry of fact checkers was so maligned by those who were consistently being fact checked, that it actually became something that people promoted, that they were being fact checked, or that CNN or MSNBC ran a critical report on them. That became something that actually they would share to the reporters, because again, it reinforces belief of there being like this mainstream media or social media agenda against a certain political party or political beliefs. And so you've seen just consistent efforts. And I mean, we get this personally from the Russians all the time in our work, is just to have ad hominem attacks against what we do, because then anything we put out that brings to light something that they have done that is clearly in the world of disinformation, they just point to like, well, look, these are these, NATO funded neocons, which like both are not true. But again, they're able to just attack the industry itself. And so then anything that comes out of it is both not believed, but even to some degree actually helps their cause.
Perfectly into my next thing. That made my head spin, thank you. So I guess it was something that Ilya said earlier about, we need more good journalism that we can trust. And I obviously agree with that. I think finances are not really conducive to that in the industry. But then when Matt said, I'm not sure that that's really the answer to the problem, I wanted to point out two things and just ask a question. That one thing I've experienced as a journalist is that people tend to call, they call whatever outlet I write for fake news immediately. You don't read, obviously, the stories I publish. And then they even go so far as to say, you're fake news. Like, I literally get this bizarre comment. So when Allison said misinformation silences voices, I think it also works that way in the sense of people just will not read. Like, as many good resources as there are out there, I just don't think people are reading them. They just push it away and stick to Fox News and do what they do. I have one sort of solution, and this is my question about hearing a little more. I think we need to figure this out. But Michael had mentioned responsible media consumption, but I actually feel that as journalists, we also have a responsibility to be more transparent than we ever have been about how we are making what we make, because nobody trusts our sources anymore. They think we just make everything up, So I guess that's really my question. How do you deal with people who think that everything you do is just like made up and your outlet is garbage and, like that? And then what else can we do?
Outlet, which is what we do is we try in every investigation to publish as much of the original material as possible, the original documents, the original corporate records, the original bank records that our reporting is based on. And not every reader is going to read that. In fact, I know that only a tiny percentage are ever going to click on the box to expand the thing to look at the actual contract with the signature of the corrupt official or whatever. But I think for us, I think that does build trust with our audience, and it's hard. I mean, on the one hand, that it builds trust with our audience. On the other hand, someone else who wanted to make something fake could make something that looks pretty much the same as what we do, but it would be fake. And there's not much we can do about that. So I guess that's not really much of an answer, but I think that's what we've thought of is, I mean, I think there are always going to be people who will never believe you no matter what. And I mean, you see people who literally don't believe something that they see with their own eyes. You see, or, they interpret it in their own way. I read the Russian Telegram channels, which are sharing the same videos of playgrounds being bombed in Kiev that we're seeing from our side. And they are celebrating them and saying, finally, we're hitting the Nazi bastards back. And so that's almost not even living in two different factual universes. That's addressing the same factual universe from such totally different perspectives that it's kind of impossible to imagine them ever being reconciled. So you're never going to convince some people, but you can maybe convince what I was saying earlier about you want to be trusted. I think you want to speak to the issues that the people care about. And that's why I was talking about local news. I think that there's no way somebody living in some rural, maybe very conservative place is going to even read the New York Times or believe in what the New York Times is saying, no matter how great their reporting is, because they're over there in New York. They're not doing the reporting there locally. And I think that that kind of trust building of being in the community and doing the reporting that is important for that community is probably even more important than the kind of, show the documents kind of stuff that we do. So that would be my partial answer to that.
I would also just add, I think, sorry, Michael's point of making sure that you're elevating reporters from within communities to tell their own stories, and oftentimes the stories that aren't being told are from the perspectives that aren't being told. I also think is critically important, particularly as communities are divided. And so I don't think that it doesn't mean you can't write about what you don't know, but it does mean that we need newsrooms and outlets need to be paying attention and supporting and doing the real intentional work of making sure that those journalists have a voice and that they're able to tell their own stories.
I'm sorry, I was going to say as well, when you're asking if you want to introduce yourself, I know I didn't ask you to introduce yourself more. Okay. And I'll just tomorrow. Do you have any other questions?
I have a question. I'm Maggie. I'm a senior here at Tufts. It's for Ilya. But you said earlier, I think you had a refreshing perspective on the idea of like AI and all of these changing landscapes. And we're thinking about how local media can kind of like have a resurgence, and we're thinking about how young people consume media. I don't really see a future where like anybody in our generation is going to be turning on the TV at 10 p.m. to watch the local news. If there's any positive predictions in that area of changing landscapes, how can local media actually take advantage of that changing landscape?
About this kind of stuff, half the time what I'm thinking is, oh my God, in 5 years, I'm not going to have a job because there's going to be some AI tool that does my job for me. I think that to the extent that AI kind of stuff can do sort of aggregate low-level work that can be synthesized by a human, I think that can help address the lack of human bodies that are doing this work locally. You already have stuff like automatic sort of algorithms writing, finance stories like this stock, outperformed the market today. This stock, did poorly today, and you don't need a human to do that. I don't know how you would operationalize that on a sort of local level, but, we're doing to the extent that maybe, for example, I'm really just thinking off the top of my head here, we do a lot of work with databases, and we can do a lot better work with big data when government records are more open and accessible, because that kind of data, when it's structured corporate records or, government tenders or tax records or things like that, when they're structured in a intelligent way and made freely available, you can analyze them in various ways. And right now we sort of do it primitively with, Excel spreadsheets, but I think that pretty soon that kind of stuff will be doable with AI. And you can do that on a local level and then have human reporters still, interpreting that data for people. So that seems like it could be promising, but certainly with maybe even less imagination than it took me to think of that, you can think of all kinds of pernicious ways that AI could be used to spread horrific disinformation or make fakes that are absolutely impossible to identify as fakes. So I'm usually a pretty optimistic person, and I'm not like a doom and gloom kind of guy, but really on this topic, I sort of struggle to find something that makes me hopeful. So I'm just going to be honest about that.
We have a brief question. Maybe we could fit in one more question. Yeah,
my name's Josh. I'm a student here at Fletcher. My question is for Ilya. You spoke earlier about the need to see good journalism, as a public good. Now, there are some countries where that is in fact the case. And I would be pretty apprehensive, I suppose, if some of these subsidies and whatnot were coming from the government to fund these news outlets. So just how would you reconcile that idea then of maintaining trust and not going down the slippery slope towards the Ministry of Truth, but also having this idea of a public good.
There was one. And there was some discussion about the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is a body that overseed, or maybe still oversees, honestly, I haven't been keeping up with it, US funding of outlets like the Voice of America, or even maybe Radio Free Europe. And the basic point is that when that is done clumsily, it doesn't work and it becomes propaganda. When it's done well, it absolutely works. And, I have incredible collaborations with fellow journalists at Radio Free Europe based in Prague, which is a US government funded outlet, but they do some of the best investigative work, for example, in Central Asia, where we also do a lot of work. So I know from experience, it's extremely possible. And by the way, that work is sometimes very critical of the US too. And our work as well is, half of, maybe more than half of the reporting we do is pointing out hypocrisy in, places like London or New York or Miami, or where Western, legal systems or corporate ways of corporate organization enable corrupt people from around the world to stash their money and launder their money. So we certainly are not, even though we also receive a lot of funding from the US State Department, from the UK, from various other governments, from Open Society Foundation, we haven't become beholden to them because they have no impact on the editorial content of our work. And I think it can be organized that way. But of course, you look at, government funding media in Russia, China, et cetera. Of course, I totally see the problem you're pointing out, but I think you just have to design it in a way and have it be there should be political will to have it be independent, which sadly isn't always the case.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you. This concludes our discussion for this afternoon. Thank you to all our audience members for your questions. Thank you to our panelists for providing such interesting, nuanced, ranging responses. So I wanted to add that we have 3 more panels tomorrow. So please do not forget about those. At 9:30, we have a conversation with Christina Goldblum, who is based in Kabul, Afghanistan, Francisco at 9:30. At 10 o'clock, we have a discussion on chronicling war and occupation with Lauren Wolf. And at 11:30, we have our conversation on the role of women in journalism, all in Barnum 008. So I wanted to also just thank a couple of people, to Heather Berry for the support, the coordination, to the other IGL student leaders who all helped us to kind of put this together, to reach out to all of these incredible panelists, and to thank Tisch College for giving us the space, the platform to have this conversation, which I think has just showcased the importance of the Institute for Global Leadership, the value that we have in having these conversations. So I really, really do appreciate everybody taking the time to come. And yeah, thank you for attending our panel. We'll have refreshments outside from Mint.
Thank you.
Yeah.